at right now being home. Today I was invited to talk about the future of the refrigerants. This is what I do for a living, is talk about refrigerants and help work on them and develop them. And so I've given this presentation and made modifications to it many times. And so we'll try to give you a little, all right, move to the next slide. Oh, there we go. Hopefully it doesn't change too many slides. Talk a little bit about the refrigerant history and the societal impact that it has. So, you know, we work in an industry and we take for granted a lot of times, I think, how much impact we have actually on the society. And I think during this COVID-19 crisis, we're starting to see the impact that the industry has, at least on the medical side and on the food transport side, and how things are very integrated. We're going to talk a little bit about the impact. Why are we doing this? What the HFCs that we're using right now, what their impact on the global warming is. And we'll talk about the regulation and timing, and then the challenges with selecting the right refrigerant, and then talk about some of the choices that are out there by application. Then I'll give you a little history or a little future, what I think the future might hold. So refrigerant history and a little societal impact. So here's the history of refrigerants. As far back as the 1830s, people were looking for, during the Industrial Revolution as it was occurring, people were figuring out, you know, how can I, you know, not keep things cold in the summer and maybe heat things in the winter, and electricity wasn't around at that point back then. So people were mainly transporting ice or trying to make ice and then make that ice and transport it to a location where people could put it in their refrigerator and keep things a little cooler. Then at one point, somebody says, well, you know, these fluids, they give off an evaporative effect, cooling effect, much like water on your skin. And how can we mechanically do that? And so people started looking for whatever worked from a chemical standpoint. And so people were, you know, the first compressors that were developed were around ammonia. And so people were just looking for industrial process. A lot of times at this generation, though, a lot of people didn't understand the chemistry. And so these were fluids that came off industrial processes, and they had some characteristic to them, but they didn't know the, you know, the atoms and how they bound to each other. So in the 1930s and 20s, they discovered, or last 20 years before that, discovered that carbons and other atoms are bonded to each other, and can we make designer compounds? So much like today, what we do with pharmaceuticals, where we make specific drugs, back then they were doing some basic building blocks, taking carbon, and Thomas Midgley and Albert Henny. Henny was the chemist and Thomas Midgley was the mechanical engineer. And Thomas would come up with structures, and he'd had Albert go to the lab and make them. So back then, these compounds were not known, and processes for how to make them was not known. And so what they would do is make compounds. And what Midgley thought and what he theorized was, you know, when you have hydrogen on an atom, it's flammable. If I can put a chlorine, a fluorine, or a bromine on the atom, I can make it less combustible or non-flammable. And so this is where all the CFCs came from. And these were all things that had chlorofluorocarbons. There were no hydrogens on the molecules outside of maybe R22, which the HCFCs are shown here. But this was the first generation of refrigerants, which was really after safety and chemical stability, so we could use various materials. Then we, in the 70s, discovered that the CFCs are long-lived compounds, and the chlorines destroy ozone in the upper atmosphere. We have to remember that, you know, as we go forward here in time, we're always learning new things about how man has impact on the environment, or how we, you know, how we do processes, or how we even detect these materials. New innovations occur. And so we learned that we needed to shorten the atmospheric life of compounds, or remove the chlorines. In a lot of cases, just removing the chlorine. So we came up with HFCs, or hydrofluorocarbons. And they're shown here is a mixture of HCFCs like R22 and 123, which had lower impact on the ozone depletion, and so they were allowed to live longer from a regulatory standpoint, but then everybody has moved to HFCs or HFC blends. And so what you see here is 400 series materials like 410A, 404A, which are blends of various HCFCs together. Now today what we're facing is global warming. Unknown during the third generation was a lot of the CFCs had very high global warming impacts. And so naturally moving to HFCs, we lowered the global warming impact, but the HFCs still have long lives. And so what we've learned in the last 20 years is we need to have molecules that have very short atmospheric lives. So when they are released into the atmosphere, they quickly decompose and come back out of the atmosphere. And so now what we've been working with are very low global warming potential HFCs or HFOs, as hydrofluoroolefins as they've been called. And so these compounds are unique that they have a structure in them, chemical structure of a double bond that shortens their atmospheric life. And we'll talk about that later on in the presentation. So society continues to demand environmental or other performance expansions, and so it drives refrigerant innovation. So let's talk a little bit about the societal impact. And so here's a picture of my father back in Arcadia, Wisconsin in 1942 with his brother, Marcel. And of course, this is Rover. My dad had 3 different Rovers on the farm here in Arcadia. And in this picture, he didn't have electricity. And they didn't have running water inside the house. It was outside the house. So, you know, a lot has changed in 70 years around food preservation, security. You know, back then it was limited to local. It had to be grown and used quickly, or it was preserved. There was very limited long-term storage and distribution, a lot of spoilage, and there was restricted ability to move without spoilage. Productivity, my dad would talk about having to work at night during the summer on various things. You know, health was deaths from heat waves and food spoilage were common, and populations, you know, were restricted in movement or expansion to really hot climates because you just didn't have the productivity or the ability to control your environment to be able to maximize it. So we go 80 years later, 70 years later, here's his grandson. These are his dogs, Mikey, Cowboy, and Cody. And food preservation and security, we have global movement of food, right? It's not uncommon to get oranges from Morocco or Chilean grapes in the winter. So we have fresh food from long locations. We have long-term storage, and we preserve that through deep frozen key additions. So for example, if you watch Wicked Tuna on TV, you know, those large tunas are quickly frozen to deep frozen and shipped within a day or two to Japan, in a lot of cases for sushi grade tuna. And ASHRAE and a lot of members here over the years have done a lot of work on, you know, how do you preserve fish proteins at what temperatures and how long it lasts. Now, productivity is unrestricted and optimized. You know, there's optimal temperatures for people and humidity. Health, there's limited deaths compared to the past on heat waves. And so we're able to move to large cities, and we're able to have populations move to warmer climates, and then population can expand upon that. So, you know, refrigerants of the past and the future have driven this huge societal standard of living improvement that we take for granted. That is pretty standard today. So as we change refrigerants, how do we maintain that and increase that societal improvement? So let's look at the impact of hydrocarbons, halocarbons on global warming. So here's some stuff from the NOAA on the impact of various refrigerants and other emissions and gases that are occurring, and why are we doing this? So, you know, it's not a surprise here on the left, we see carbon dioxide as the largest contributor to global warming. You can see the increasing amount of gases. Methane, you know, cows burping and farting gives off methane, and so methane is a target gas. Surprising to many people, nitrous oxide from burning fossil fuels is a a significant global warming to gases as well. So just the combustion of gases, maybe even the leakage of methane from the collection of it to burn it to carbon dioxide and nitric oxide contribute to a large amount of the global warming in the atmosphere. And look at here, number 4 is still the CFC R12. So that is the concern. As you look on the chart on the right, you see this blue mound, which is the CFCs. And if we would have continued with the CFCs, we would have been way up here in your impacts. And so what we're trying to do here is, as HFCs have their impacts, we want to get them to have less of an impact by lowering their global warming potential so that we can keep our equivalents of gigatons of our emissions below a certain amount. So, if F-gases, HFCs were unregulated, we could contribute at about a 0.5 degree increase. For example, the magnitude of these gases is, if you released 1 pound of 134A from your car, it's equivalent to 1.3 metric tons of carbon dioxide. So you can burn a lot of methane to equal 1 pound of 134A. So the magnitude, even though these are small emissions, they live in the atmosphere a long time, and so they can contribute more. So here's a chart of atmospheric life on the left-hand side and global warming potential on the x-axis. And what you see here is you got the CFCs up here. We have extremely long atmospheric half-lives. So a lot of these materials will going to be in the atmosphere long beyond many, many generations of humans on the Earth. And so these are just half-lives of these materials. So they can contribute, 10,000 global warming potential impacts versus 1 ton of carbon. So we phased down to HCFCs and HFCs, and we did bring them down quite a bit. Instead of being at the 10,000 range, we're averaging in the 1,000 range. So we made an improvement, even though we didn't really mean to do that improvement, get rid of the chlorine on the molecule. But today, what we're looking at is trying to get refrigerants down below in this range. And so this is where the haloolefins have a global warming impact is around 1 with atmospheric half-lives of days. So within 3 or 4 months, most of these materials have reacted in the atmosphere with light and the reactive oxygen species that are in the atmosphere and quickly come out of the atmosphere and no longer are gases. So the goal here, we have 2 choices. We can either reduce our emissions out of our equipment, which has been difficult to do because we can't get that to 0, or shorten atmospheric life, or do both. And so as we move forward, we're always trying to lower emissions and also shorten the atmospheric life to get lower global warming. I just want to do a quick check that you can hear me. Mark,
Steve, we can hear you. It's still working well, so it's going great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. So what are people doing here from a regulatory standpoint to phase down the HFC's global warming impact? So this is a phase down, very unlike the ozone depletion regulation where we phased out. So where they selected compounds like R12, can't use it anymore. In this case, they want you to phase down the global warming potential. So some HFCs will be needed that have higher global warming potential that'll be diluted down with something that has very low global warming potential. And so we'll be doing a phase down rather than a phase out, because these compounds will be needed in the future for various applications. So it's mostly a control of pollution into the atmosphere rather than just getting rid of compounds. Some will naturally go away just because you just won't be able to use enough of it to make it worthwhile. So when you look at regulation around the world, the Montreal Protocol, which regulated ozone depleting compounds, was amended to allow to regulate fluorinated compounds as well from a global warming standpoint. So back in 2015, 16, if I remember right, the countries have been talking about it for a while, but they modified the Montreal Protocol through the Kigali Agreement. And it sets up a timing for lower global warming refrigerant transitions. And so what countries have to do is establish a baseline, and on average in the United States, if you take all the gases we use that are fluorinated and used around for foams, solvents, and refrigerants and other materials, on average, we have about a 2,000 GWP. Some are higher, some are lower. And so the idea here is to phase down in GWP over time. So here we are sitting in 2020. And so the Europeans had already had an F-gas law in place, and this is kind of what their phase down schedule is. Next year, they'll be doing another step down. But the idea here is to get this 2,000 GWP baseline down to around 300 at some final date. So it's establishing about an 85% phase down in timing. So what the developed countries agreed to outside the European Union, we agreed to a phase down in this characteristic, essentially ending up in the same place at the same time roughly as the EU F-gas, but taking these large steps down in GWP and driving different refrigerant choices along the way. Now the developed countries are way out here, and there are two types of developing countries. And so they have longer phase out dates, and this is very similar to the ozone depletion phase out. They had very long phase out dates until new technologies were identified and developed in the developed countries, and these eventually will be pulled forward, I believe, over time. But everybody's trying to get down to roughly about a 300 GWP for all HFCs or all fluorinated materials that are used. So it's a basket of gases that people can have stuff that's lower than 300, maybe one, like in the use of 1234YF in cars, versus something that might be 400, 500, 600 in the case of maybe R32 used for HVAC over time. So countries regulate and have this basket of gases that they can create regulation around to meet their phase down targets. So it's much more complex than just saying that compound is gone or chemical is gone. But so all refrigerants are available for use. It's just a matter of, can you use them in their pure form, or can you blend them to give them the attributes you'd like? So on top of this, in the United States, it's just a mess with the EPA losing their ability to regulate HFCs. They had put out two different rules, EPA SNAP rules 20 and 21, and those were overturned because under SNAP, that is regulation around ozone depleting compounds, and the federal government courts found when the EPA was sued over this that they don't have the ability to regulate HFCs under that law. Now, there's a lot of actions going on that the Congress is working on, and a lot of support here to give EPA that authority, but under the Trump administration, it's very unlikely. And so what is happening here is states are stepping up to do their own regulation, and you can see on the chart here, there are, I mean, a lot of states, 25 states, which is roughly about 55% of the population, are starting to put in some form of HFC regulations, you know, and being led by California and the California Resources Board to try to start regulating HFCs. Now, using the guidelines that EPA came up under SNAP, a lot of times they're trying to establish that. But in the end, regulation, I think, is going to be fragmented until the EPA has some authority to set some minimum guidelines for this phase down. So changing subjects here a little bit and moving on, what refrigerants and how do we select refrigerants around the most sustainable refrigerants, and what the timing is and what the challenges are in this transition. So when you look at the refrigerant replacement challenge, we have this, you know, regulatory environment in the center, and they're setting targets on various environmental practices, or even safety for that matter, you know, from an industry standpoint, how safe is that refrigerant to use? We've been very used to, since Midgley and Henny developed non-flammable refrigerants, that we've taken that for granted that we can put as much refrigerant inside the equipment without asphyxiating people, but we don't have any flammability risk. And so my job is to, and the industry's been working toward, is trying to balance key factors around the direct GWP of the fluid itself, around the efficiency of the equipment, because you are burning fuel and expelling carbon dioxide as emissions, trying to balance the safety aspects and around the transition costs that may occur, because there might be multiple steps in the phase down, and then ensuring that we have some product sustainability for the customers at the end. So, the challenge is selecting the right refrigerants with the best balance. In the last transition, lubricant selection was the greatest challenge, and so we developed these HFCs, but we didn't have a lubricant to go with them, and that was all the work I did in the 90s. Was we had to develop polyol ester lubricants, polyethylene glycol PAGs. There's also polyvinyl ethers, PVE oils that are used now with the HFCs, and so we developed all these new oils that didn't exist at that point. In this transition, even though we're going to have some non-flammable refrigerants, we're also going to have to deal with some flammable refrigerants as well. And there's a variety of different flammable refrigerants out there, and ASHRAE Standard 34 classifies refrigerants in two different ways. We have toxicity, which is either an A or a B, and one is lower toxicity and higher toxicity. And that number is really divided around the 400 part per million occupation exposure limit line. And it really dictates the difference between being able to use a refrigerant as a direct expansion or it's relegated to an equipment room. And it really, in the last transition, we had some Class B refrigerants that we used. Ammonia has been around forever. That's a Class B. And so is refrigerant 123 and refrigerant 245FA. And so they're easily used in equipment rooms, putting in place ventilation. And these are usually used on large charge equipment anyway, so they don't make great direct expansion fluids. Now, really, the difference between on the flammability side, the difference between a Class 1 and the rest is there are non-flammables, or what we call no flame propagation, when we try to ignite them, and the rest are all flammable. And trying to have the standard put in place, the various classifications around flammability, it's really hard to put some science around this, where there are some, thermodynamic or rules of law, natural rules of law between these. I always look at it as man has put these targets at different levels, and what we've learned in the industry is if you have the right ignition source and you have enough fuel there, it will ignite it, it will be flammable. So these aren't so much specific limits as there's different characteristics between these various refrigerants. So for example, Class 1s, there's non-flammable, which is most refrigerants today. We have these new class called 2L, which is lower flammable refrigerants. And they're just classified by having a burning velocity, or how fast they propagate in a very controlled setting at less than 10 centimeters per second. The characteristic that's really important here in this class is they have a high, lower flammability limit where you can have a lot of the fuel present, and they have a higher ignition energy. So it takes a stronger source to ignite them. Unlike natural gas in your house that leaks in and you accidentally flip a light switch and it can ignite, these refrigerants don't ignite that easily. And then we have Class 3s, which are really the hydrocarbons, methane, propane, in that class. And there's a few in the Class 2 area, like 152A, but it's really 2Ls and 3s to a large extent that are being used or being proposed to use. And so the lower flammability limit is getting less as you go up from 2L to 2 to 3. And the minimum ignition energies are going down quite drastically between 2Ls and 3s. And so those are some of the flammability basics. So let's talk about the basics. So a lot of people probably have started a fire, right? You need some fuel. And so we call that the refrigerant charge. And then we need an ignition source. So for 2Ls, a lot of cases, it's you know, it's more energy than pulling out a light plug from a wall where you get a light spark. You need a good source, you need a strong spark or an open flame to get them. So if you could bring the fuel together at the right concentration, which is above the lower flammability limit, and you have the right ignition source, you can get an ignition event. So when you start a campfire, right, you got to have your fuel, and then you might have a supplement fuel that some people use, like gasoline, to get it started. Something that's easier to ignite to get off the heat to get it started. So you got to bring those events together. And if you're really good at starting a fire, you know what it takes to have the right ignition source and the right fuel to get started. So when you look at this, that's the probability of that event. And so the industry has been studying really hard what the probability might be for these two things to come together. So how do we control these things is from an HVAC equipment side, we can control the ignition sources of the equipment, and we can control the amount of refrigerant we use. So the new standards are going to have, you know, how well we can control our ignition sources on our equipment, and then we limit the amount of fuel that is in the equipment that can leak into a space. So once you have that ignition event, we've been studying the severity of that event and seeing how, you know, how to control that or, you know, minimize either the fuel charge or the refrigerant charge to lessen that severity of the event. And then we have to look at the exposure risks and recovery from an event from the standpoint of when you're burning fluorinated refrigerants, you get hydrofluoric acid. So the industry is conducting a lot of risk assessments by application type to understand the probability of event, the severity, and then the exposure and recovery. And so we've been working on refrigerant flammability since about 2014, and we're getting closer and closer every day to understanding all the different aspects. It's sort of like peeling an onion. I look at it. You look at it from a big view. You peel one layer and you learn some things. You peel another layer. In the end, you know, it just keeps trying to understand all the different possibilities. Because in the past, you know, we can leak refrigerant in a room, have open flame, and the flames didn't propagate. So it's going to be a totally new understanding for the industry. So here's a picture from some of the industry research we did 3-4 years ago. So, you know, one of the things we learned was when you blow refrigerant in the room, it acts as two-phase. A lot of times you don't realize that. You think you're blowing pure vapor in the room, but since the refrigerant is colorless and it has no surface tension, it can not show up and see it on the floor. But in this case, we were pouring refrigerant into the room. We had an ignition source, and you can see the flame there in the center. You know, some were harder to ignite than others. You have to get to that lower flammability limit, and you have to have the right ignition source. And so these were considered what you call worst case scenarios. You know, it's unlikely these events occur, but we wanted to see what the phenomenons were and how different issues could occur from cooling. So in the center there, you see a box, and that is really to simulate a obstruction like a couch or a divider to concentrate the refrigerant on one side of the room. But, you know, all these flammable ridges can create, you know, severe events, but the risk is different from class 2, 2, and 3s. So like methane will incinerate your house, you know, take it apart and blow it up into small little twigs, where a 2L will be more like a log, catch on fire, and will burn like a sustained burn versus having a big overpressure event like methane might from a furnace leak. So some of the flammable refrigerants we're using today, we have over 11 million cars in the United States using 1234YF as a refrigerant, which is a 2L. If you buy a new car today, there's about a 50-50 chance that it'll have 1234YF in it. So it's going around, people are using it. It's 100% adopted in Europe. And so that is by far, I think, the widest used 2L refrigerant in the world. Now, the beauty here, though, is, you know, refrigerant charges are very small. You may have ignition sources in a car, but it's usually outside that are strong enough. And so this is a very low risk application that we're using from a refrigerant standpoint. High risk application to drive your car around. So this risk from using the refrigerant is much lower. Now, the other thing is that's showing up too, and it's widespread, is small portable refrigerators and freezers are starting to use hydrocarbons, either propane or isobutane. Isoputane is R600A, and so here's some nameplates off here, or propane is R290. So you can see here quickly that these are in the hydrocarbon area, we're trying to limit the charge to very small amounts. That's really can't control the ignition sources. And then the ignition sources are many, can be as low as static electricity in case of the hydrocarbons. And then we can use larger charges with the YF because it takes a much stronger ignition source. So that's a challenge as we get to bigger and bigger equipment where you have tens of pounds or even hundreds of pounds. How do we handle those flammable refrigerants if we need to use them in those applications? So let's talk about the 4th generation of refrigerants. And like I talked earlier, the chemical feature that causes reactivity in the atmosphere is this carbon-carbon double bond. You can see it showing up over here in all these molecules. And this double bond, and I've written a couple papers on this, and there's a number of papers out there by others as well about what the atmospheric chemistry does to react with that. Now, a lot of people say, well, if it's unstable in the atmosphere, it should be unstable in the equipment. Well, I wrote a paper on that too. That's not the case. It's really, you need light and you need moisture and you need oxygen radicals in the atmosphere that provide. In the equipment, you don't have the light or the atmospheric reactivity molecules as well. So you may have moisture, but we've found that a lot of these molecules are very stable. So here's 1234YF, and I wasn't going to go through the nomenclature from standard 34 because each one of these numbers tells you how to describe each of these molecules, so how it's set up. If you'd like to have some interesting reading, I still have to have the standard in front of me for a lot of this stuff to show how to design these molecules or what the nomenclature is. So the key characteristic here is you can see YF is flammable, 1234ZE in this case as flammable as well. But you can see the characteristic here is low GWPs. They're not all flammable. So here's 1233ZDE. It's an A1 and it's being used in chillers today, partly because it is a non-flammable refrigerant and it's easy to adopt a non-flammable refrigerant. Here's another new one too that people are proposing, 1224YD. It's an A1. Now what's interesting with all the innovation occurring, people are blending the materials together to get the characteristic you want. So here is R514A, which is an azeotrope. It's got a low GWP. It takes two different HFOs or HCFOs in this case, or HCOs, hydrochloroolefins. So this is dichloroethylene, 1,2-dichloroethylene. And this is actually one of the molecules that Carrier used back in the 1920s in dialene. So this molecule has been around a while, has great environmental characteristics. It's flammable, but the new molecule, 1336 MZZE, in this case, if you blend it with it, you make an azeotrope, but you make a class 1, so it's non-flammable, low GWP. So we have 6 new molecules. We have 9 older molecules that people are blending together with various HFOs, hydrochlorofluoroolefins. There's a new iodine molecule out there as a non-flammable agent. It's an old molecule, but being repurposed. We have carbon dioxide, the natural refrigerants, getting closer looked at, ammonia and hydrocarbons, of course, we talked about. So that's the toolbox people are playing with today, trying to phase down the GWP in many cases. So here's a summary of the less than 10 GWPs that were in that previous toolbox. You know, many of these need to be blended to get the optimized properties. So what I have here is COP with 123 being equal to 1. So if you come out to here, there's 1. And then here's the compressor displacement, a logarithmic of that. And so these are the low pressure refrigerants where you have need a large displacement to the high pressure refrigerants here, which is 410A and R32. You see here, there's R22 here. And you can see that there's a nice relationship of the lower pressure refrigerants thermodynamically are more efficient because they have higher critical temperatures. And the lower pressure, the lower pressure refrigerants have a higher critical temperature. And then the higher pressure refrigerants have a lower critical temperature and thus are thermodynamically less efficient, depending on that. So we have opportunity to blend a lot of different things. So you see today, 410A today is a blend of 32 with refrigerant 125, which is the non-flammable agent. It's blended at 50-50 to get 410A. And so one of the candidates today are R32, you just take the 125 out of it. 125 has a very high global warming potential. Then people are blending various other refrigerants in with R32. So people are taking R32 and putting 1234YF in it. And where is 1234? Oh, right here. Putting 1234YF in it and lowering the GWP further of R32. So you see refrigerants out there, and we'll talk about that, 454B, which is a blend of these two materials, trying to preserve the capacity of 410A while lowering the GWP. So here's another critical temperature versus compressor displacement. Like I was saying earlier, these have a much higher critical temperature, the lower pressure refrigerants, and then the higher pressure refrigerants down here have much lower critical temperatures. So, you know, the key is we want to stay subcritical so that we can preserve the efficiency of the cycle so we don't drive a lot of the vapor compression, the work we do into the cycle into hot gas. Rather, we want to be able to condense it as a liquid and then pass it back through our cycle, not having to do all that work within the compressor. So here's all the refrigerant alternatives with flammability on the chart as well versus global warming potential. And so what you see here is global warming potential, and here's compressor displacement. So just to calibrate some people, here's 410A over to the right. It's got a GWP around 2,000. It's got a compressor displacement in tons per CFM around 1. Here's 404A. Very high GWP. More like R22 in compression or vapor or compressor displacement. And we have the 134A-like materials. Then we have the 123-like materials over here. And everything that's in blue, if you can see that, is non-flammable. And so we have a lot of non-flammable replacements down here in the low pressure area that are very low GWP. And as we move to the right and get less and less compressor displacement or higher pressure, you can see that we have a flammability limit that's developed here where we have to get the lower GWPs. We start to become what is called red here, which is 2L. And so even if we get further out here like 410A, we still are not low enough in GWP for the long term. And so as a takeaway here shows the kind of the various limits where the non-flammable lines. So you see a lot of people adopting these lower GWP refrigerants, to like for 404A to go from 4,000 down to 13 to 1,500. You see people adopting replacements for 134A, get you down about 600. But you see a lot of 123-like or 245FA-like materials that can get you down below 10 and still be non-flammable. And those are being introduced to the marketplace along this line since they don't need to be regulated around flammability. So let's kind of look at these alternatives by sector. So let's look at 123. We have a lot of, obviously I was saying earlier, you know, we have low GWPs, they're non-flammable, they have good efficiency, and then we have some near design compatible, what I call fluids that you could replace the previous fluid with. So for example, here's 123, GWP is low, but it was an ozone depleter. Here's 514A. It's very close in capacity to it. You can see there's 1233ZD, which is being adopted globally. It has more capacity. It's a complete redesign. It's not near another center line or not a design compatible center line. This new 1224YD, it's very close to 245FA in compressor displacement. So it's looked as a design compatible replacement for people who are making chillers with 245FA. So these are all good choices. They're high efficiency. I would consider all as long-term solutions to replace HCFCs and HFCs. And there are quite a few products in the marketplace around 514A and 1233 ZDE available globally, and the new YD is starting to emerge in various regions of the world. So when you look at 134A replacements, the story is very similar to the 123, 245FA replacements. You just can't get to as low at GWP. So you want to stay non-flammable. You can get down from 134A is around 1300. You can drop to 300 to 600. You have to play with the compressor displacement though. So there's a azeotrope of 134A blended with YF. It's 513A. It gets to about 600. Very similar compressor displacement, so it's considered design compatible. Or you can jump over here and have lower compressor displacement and have blends of 1234ZE blended with 227EA and gives you these 515 materials and stay non-flammable, but you have a big compressor displacement change. So what you see in the marketplace is people adopting some 513A in the United States and overseas. You still see a large majority of 134A products still being shipped, but especially in the European Union area, you're seeing 1234ZE products being adopted just because the GWP is so low. And this fluid is very unique and it's considered flammable, but it's non-flammable at room temp. So it has an advantage of being able to be handled through the shipping and transportation area as a non-flammable refrigerant. So it has that advantage. Its disadvantage is it has a much lower capacity. A lot of these either are azeotropes and have no glide. The biggest issue we've seen so far is these refrigerants all have lower compressor superheats, meaning they're less efficient when you compress them. And we're this lower compressor discharge superheat, in the past we relied on to drive refrigerant out of the oil and do other things like heat up at low temps, but we've been that is one of the design challenges. So we see a lot of products in the marketplace today, smaller in the United States. As soon as the regulations around flammable refrigerants adopted, we'll see much more adoption of ZE in the marketplace in the US. Looking at 404A, the story gets a little bit more complex. There's a lot of non-flammables that cut the GWP in 2/3 or half. These are all the 452A, 448A, 449A, some 407s that people have also designed as well, HFC only fluids. These other fluids are HFCs bladed with HFOs. The leading candidates get you below 300 are 2Ls, right down in this range. So you see here's the capacity of 404A. Is 1, and so as we blend various refrigerants, YF with R32 mainly, we get flammable, but we can play with the capacity in this range. The biggest issue is we have high glide when we want to get to even these moderate GWPs, but the low GWPs we have glide, and they're all flammable, and we have no low glide blends in this area. So this has been the challenge. So in the last two transitions, we had the low glide blends. We had 502 in the CFCs, and then we were able to adopt 507A or 404A. Either one, each had low glide, and so we could use flooded evaporators. So I feel there's still some innovation that's needed in this area. So the gap is we really don't have any, well, non-flammable, but we don't have any low glide options in this area. So when you jump to 410A pressures, we do have some lower glide options. And so what we see right now, people are lining around these are fluids that have been looked at quite well. A lot is R32, a blend 452B and 454B. I put 454C on here, but the capacity is much lower. It's very similar to R22, but I'm just throwing it on here as a reference point if you want to get the lower GWP. Also, people probably have read in the Cooling Post or other ASHRAE publications is there's a new blend called 466A. It appears here as the first non-flammable less than 750 GWP blend that's available. So innovation is still occurring in this area. And so this is the first non-flammable we've had that's close to 410A. The efficiency of these is equal or greater than 410A, which is a good thing. And we have some near design compatible blends. So things that are very similar in vapor compression or relative capacity to 410A. So they'll all appear here in this area. And many of these have no low or no glide. 32 has no glide. 410A has a small amount of glide. The rest of these have 1 to 4 Fahrenheit glide, so very low. The biggest issue we have is we don't have any 410A like less than 300 GWP fluids. These fluids are all around 700. At this point, 454B is the lower of that group. We do have less than 300 404 like, or what you call R22 like, but they all have high glides and very high compressor discharge temperatures. So innovation is still needed in this area, and it's active. Trying to achieve less than 300 for all products in the final solution, long-term compatible solutions. So what's the refrigerant future look like? We talked about a lot of this already. You know, achieving the Montreal Protocol HFC phase downs goal will require us to use widespread use of flammable refrigerants. We're using them in portable equipment today in small charges. Tomorrow, will we need to we'll be using flammable refrigerants, likely 2Ls in a lot of the equipment. There are good non-flammables that are ultra low, and they're already being used in the equipment today in large equipment, large chillers. So overall market trends, I just talked about the chillers. We're using some ultra low and some lower GWP blends. We're starting to see, or we'll see shortly in the next 3 to 5 years, adoption of flammable refrigerants in the scroll chiller area. But that's all going to require is we need updated standards and codes to allow their use, and we're expecting by 2024 that we'll be able to start adopting flammable refrigerants when the building codes get updated with the correct handling practices for that equipment. So the future is flammable refrigerants, and they'll be widespread to achieve our goals. So we look at these various categories. I'm just kind of repeating what the takeaway on each slide is. So I'm just going to go through these quickly. We have alternatives to the low pressure area that are non-flammable, low GWP, so that long-term is secure there. With the 134As, we're seeing some interim, fluids around 600 to 300. I say they're interim because they need to be below 300 at some point. We see adoption of flammables in Europe. We think ZE is probably going to be considered a long-term solution because it's GWP of 1. But we're always looking for better solutions because we still need to cover all the customer needs and the innovation that needs to occur in the future, especially around electrification of products. So we look at 404A. It's going to be a 2-step process. We're going to adopt some interim fluids that are moderate GWP, and then which are non-flammable. And then in the future, to adopt lower GWP fluids in this area, we're going to have to start adopting various lower flammable refrigerants or hydrocarbons in this area, or even carbon dioxide in this area. So this whole, where this refrigeration marketplace, or this marketplace was dominated by 404A or 507A, we'll start fragmenting into various specific use applications around refrigerants. And so there'll be a large amount of products coming out in this area. And at some future date, maybe they'll get consolidated around a certain refrigerant, but I doubt it. I think fragmentation in this marketplace is going to be large around refrigerant choice, potentially. And we'll have a couple steps that we're going to have to manage for the amount of refrigerants, types of refrigerants we use. So no low glide blends, that's going to cause that fragmentation to occur in this marketplace around 404A and refrigeration. So we look at the 410A future. The funny thing is we just finished our R22 transition, so now we got to phase out of 410A here shortly. So we're going to have some interim solutions, just like on the last slide with 404A. We're going to see R32 and 454B being adopted, probably 466A, potentially if it gets further vetted and gets commercialized at some point. So you're going to see many products out there on an interim basis. And then long term, we're going to need something less than 300. And so we have capacity and glide challenges as we move down in GWP. But never underestimate the ability for the industry to innovate, the refrigerant solutions area to innovate. And so people are always working on newer solutions in this area to get the GWP fluid down. So we have some good interim ones, but we have opportunity to go lower, or we're going to have to go lower. So this is kind of my vision of the future. You know, we still have the HCFC phase out occurring, and it's going to occur all the way out into 2030 with the developed countries. And so that's going to continue to show up as something we're working on. Meanwhile, we have 410A, you know, primarily replacing R22 around the world. And then we're going to have this, you know, developed country F-gas phase down that's going to occur. And then we're going to be followed by the developing countries phase down. So they're going to adopt HFCs and higher GWP fluids potentially, or the same GWP. In case of R22 and 410A are very similar. And then they're going to phase down over time. So in the end, if you look on the left here, we're talking about the iceberg. We're going to do the direct global warming impacts. Meanwhile, the energy efficiency is we're going to have to get better at that as well to make the iceberg under the water smaller as well. So we're going to have viable F gases to phase down, or hydrocarbons or carbon dioxide. We're going to see more increase of naturals, but I think it's only where safety and efficiency are met. So we're not going to put hydrocarbons in, you know, large charge equipment because of the need for safety. At some point, if we have energy efficiency standards, some refrigerants may be phased out just because of that. So on the efficiency side, you know, from an emission standpoint as well, for the iceberg under the water, we're going to see demand and electrification continue, right? Product efficiency standards will be more and more adopted across the world, and the energy use will be driven down, or the amount of carbon dioxide emitted by those products will be reduced. And some lower efficiency refrigerants, I think, in these products will be phased out. I'm thinking about carbon dioxide if we had efficiency standards as we move forward. We're talking way out. We're talking 20 years from now. Potentially some refrigerants may be phased out just because of that. Building efficiency standards from a system standpoint, we're going to be using less energy in the future. Maybe more people, less energy per person. But really, as we move forward, you know, building HVAC and building design and how we do buildings to be more sustainable will drive the electrical loads down as well. Always in the right direction, using less and less electricity or burning of fossil fuels to get to electricity. So the biggest portion, I think, is just greening in the grid will enable our ability to meet the ever increasing demands and reducing our carbon dioxide emissions into the atmosphere. So I took this picture this morning right outside my house. One of the things people should get out in the morning or get out at night and see the sunrises, because this is a very opportune time with pollution being so low, probably lower than in my entire lifetime. The sunrises and the sunsets are changing along with with the lack of airline traffic. The skies are blue or normal. So get out there and like I say here, men continue to argue, nature acts. So thank you. And I'll take any questions. I have another picture from the sunrise this morning too. So we're at a double sun.
Awesome, Steve. Those are wonderful pictures at the close of this complicated topic. Just for the rest of you, if you aren't aware, Steve is our regional refrigeration RVC, regional vice chair. We're so pleased to be able to have Steve in our region with this kind of knowledge base and his capabilities, which is a real positive for us. And so it gives us a great pleasure to have him join on the regional level from my perspective. So I haven't seen any questions pop up. We grew up to about 30 people on it. We are continuing to record. So I know you did this presentation for your lacrosse chapter and you shared the slides. So that might be something we could do as well. I can take everybody off and allow any questions from an audio perspective. Let's see here, attendees. So I'm going to take everybody off. And if anybody wanted to throw out questions, you're welcome to do that, or just offer up even gratitude for Steve's contribution today.
Steve, Jim Kraus here. Are you able to hear me?
I am.
Appreciate the presentation. It was well done. I have a question. You may have covered it, but I may have missed it. Was glide. When you talk about glide and the refrigerant, what does that mean?
Yeah, so glide can be a very complicated topic, and actually you can have a whole presentation on the impact glide. So when you have two different fluids that have different boiling points, the difference between their boiling points is considered glide, and how we measure glide is the difference between, a fluid is coming in to say, let's say an evaporator, and the higher pressure fluid boils off first, whereas the lower pressure, lower or higher boiling point material boils off second. So the difference between those two temperatures, between the initiation of the bubble point versus the dew point, is at a certain condition is considered what is called temperature glide. And so how that impacts us is we want to get very tight approach between let's say the temperature we're trying to deliver and the heat we're trying to reject or trying to put into a fluid. And so that can be considered a loss in work, meaning I have to drive the temperature down in the case I want to deliver a constant temperature, and the glide will impact it that way, or I have to drive to a higher temperature on the condenser to compensate for that difference in boiling points between two fluids. In many cases, a lot of these blends maybe have 4 fluids in them, like a 448A has 4 different fluids in it. And so the glide can be quite the impact on the approach temperature and even vapor condenser or both.
Okay. Does the numbers associated with the refrigerants have anything to do with that? Like you had mentioned about the 404 or whatever, that it had 4 different fluids in it? Or is
no, there's no relationship between the 400 number and the glide. Unfortunately,
the 400 number and the number of different fluids that are in there, or?
Yeah, so the difference between a 500 number, which is an azeotrope, which means the fluids come together and form what we call a chemical interaction, that they come together and form one boiling point. So when the glide is very small, less than 1/10 of a degree F, so it's really hard to distinguish the two compounds as they boil. So they'll boil as a single vapor pressure across a range of temperatures. And if the fluid doesn't have that low glide or a blended material, it is considered a 400 number. And so, yeah, in ASHRAE, the 400 number has doesn't describe the fluid. It just happens to be the next fluid that comes in line that is a unique blend of different refrigerants. So for example, 410A is a blend of 32 and 125. That happened to be the 10th refrigerant that came in line that was a blended refrigerant that was zeotropic. And we have a 410A and there's a 410B, which has a slightly different composition. And so as they come to ASHRAE, we give them a new number if they're a unique blend of those materials. And if people change the composition, then we give them an A, a B, or a C, or D. In the case of 407s, we are up to I believe.
Wow.
So there are a lot of different blends of 32, 125, and 134A.
Okay. Thank
Yeah,
you.
so I think there's like 134, if I remember right, 400 series blends, and we're up to 472. So 72 unique combinations, and then there are various compositions of those combinations.
Okay. Thank you.
You need basically to have the standard in front of you to know what the glide is or what the composition is.
Hey, Steve. Cameron Klein here. How are you?
Good, Cameron.
So it seems like your presentation, which was good, is mostly focused on the use of refrigerants in packaged systems. I do a decent amount of work in like central refrigeration plants. So I was wondering if you had any commentary on the futures of those plants. It seems like many of them are ammonia. There's some 507 out there. Any thoughts on the developments of those, the future of ammonia, the future of 507?
Yeah, so in each one of these categories, this is kind of high overview of a lot of things. I kind of have some depth in these packaged areas, but you could spend a couple presentations like this on the refrigeration area alone, because that market has a lot of challenges looking for replacements for 404A or 507A. Basically, 404A and 507A are the same fluid from a standpoint of properties. They're very close to each other. And so the challenge has been finding replacements for that. So in the refrigeration, large industrial refrigeration, it's dominated by ammonia since it's been around in the United States for a long period of time and has been well established and it has great properties. 404A, 507A have low glide, great use in flooded evaporators, non-flammable, also have the right characteristics as well. The challenge is finding replacements with low glide, and we don't have any. So what I've been seeing in the refrigeration marketplace is kind of interesting. It's fragmenting around size of equipment. So when you're in a large industrial, people keep adopting ammonia, and I don't expect to see, maybe there'll be, it's already at a very high level, high market penetration. I don't know if it'll go higher yet because I think there's still a need for smaller capacity, less complex systems that 404A and 507A can deliver in package systems in that area to do refrigeration. But I think the challenge will be is what those products will be. You'll likely see some 2L adoption. What you see in some places in Europe is you see R32 being adopted in the refrigeration marketplace, believe it or not, in its pure form because it has no glide, obviously. And so you see that being adopted in its place. Now it has its challenges too. So I don't see in the future one refrigerant, much like today where you see ammonia being the dominant refrigerant. You see people playing with carbon dioxide, you see people playing with hydrocarbons and smaller charges, you see people in the large industrial, people are trying to play with carbon dioxide. You see cascade systems occurring, people are taking chillers, either ammonia or maybe even an HFO chiller and cascading to CO2 or cascading to 404A or other fluids. And so you see a lot of innovation occurring in that marketplace. And I think it'll be unsettled for quite a while until people figure out where they're going. I don't know if that helps Cameron or not, or.
Oh, sure. Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Well, somebody had asked me to put together a presentation because I just hadn't had the time, but I started working on one on the refrigeration marketplace because there are so many products being introduced or will be introduced in the next 10 years, I think, to phase out 507, 404A. You'll even see potentially medium pressure refrigerants like 134A, like ZE and YF show up. to cascade to other refrigerants. So it'll be interesting times, I think, in that marketplace.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yep.
Good questions. Does anybody else have any comments or questions they'd like to offer up to Steve? Paul, do you have any parting words that you might want to offer as we close out the end of the 1:30? Did we lose Paul?
You probably had to go to work.
Oh, he's mute. So he's muted on his phone lines. See if he comes to it. Jason, you still with us?
Yes, I'm still here. Thank you, Steve. Appreciate the presentation. That was very informative, and appreciate you dealing with our scheduling and stuff like that. And hope you guys all have a good time at home coming up here.
Yeah. Actually, funny thing is I was in Hawaii for 2 weeks for all hell broke loose. And then when I got home, I got stuck at home. So I've been kind of on vacation since early March.
Wow.
It's not feeling like vacation anymore.
No, it's not really vacation. It's just like people say, you're not going to see anything like this in your lifetime. Hopefully again.
Yeah, let's hope for that, definitely. I did get some correspondence in regards to the Golf Pro today. The Golf Committee is still planning very optimistically to do the outing. I got a response from the Pro, and they're still planning and so willing to do that. Weather's certainly a play into it, but they're open to provide us. So we're going to go ahead with things are going to break, and we're going to get be able to get outside and get within arm's swing of everybody else. So keep that optimistically in mind, and we're going to go forward on that basis. We have a great opportunity for May. We again are going to do a virtual presentation. Bill Bonfleth is a past president of ASHRAE. I happened to be president when I was on the board. And he typically comes to Madison and does a guest speaking event for the UW class. And unfortunately, they're not traveling right now. And so therefore, he's not able to travel, but he's more than willing to do a virtual presentation. And we're very fortunate because Bill has been tagged with leading ASHRAE's ad hoc committee to address this pandemic. And so therefore he is in the leading charge of trying to bring the right players together to bring all the things together for ASHRAE. So I'm sure his days are dynamic and every day is a new adventure. So he is going to be willing to do a presentation. Again, we're going to plan it for that noon time frame. We've already set up for a webinar. So as soon as we close this meeting, it'll be converted from a go-to meeting to a webinar. So we will not have this kind of issue as next month, but plan for that. We will get that information broadcast out in the newsletter. And we're looking forward to bringing everybody together. I'm expecting we're going to have a lot more. So thank you all. And I do apologize. This was my issue. I should have anticipated more than the 26. We're looking forward to bringing it together. So thank you for joining us. And we'll look forward to meeting up soon.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, everyone. Great time.
Thanks, everyone.